Hey, welcome to Scratching the Surface. I'm Jarrett Fuller, and this is my podcast about design criticism and practice. On this week's episode, I have a wide-ranging conversation with the writer Kerry William Purcell. For the designers listening, you might know Kerry as the biographer for designers like Alexey, Brodovitch and Josef Muller-Brockmann, but he's written about topics as diverse as film, photography, politics, and philosophy. Design is really just one strand of his interest, and he's actually always been hesitant to call himself a design historian. And in this episode, we talk about that. We talk about how he, by chance, really found himself writing designer biographies and why he wants to kind of distance himself from that early work now. We talk about the intersection of design and philosophy, the role of design history, and why he sees design as a way to examine these sort of larger questions of the world. You know, Kerry really approaches design writing in the way that we talk about on the podcast all the time. He sees design as a type of cultural artifact that we can use to learn about history, about culture, about politics, about ourselves. I think this type of critical looking is very fascinating, and Kerry's truly a master at it. I had so much fun in this conversation. Kerry's great to talk to, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation as much as I did. If you're a fan of the podcast and want to help support it, you can become a member for $5 a month or $50 a year. When you become a member, you get an exclusive monthly newsletter that reflects and expands on the themes of the podcast, shares news and events about previous guests, and previews upcoming episodes. When you become a member, you help support the ongoing production of the podcast and help keep it going. I truly appreciate all of your support, and I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Kerry William Purcell. You've written about everything from photography to film to design, philosophy, politics, criticism, kind of a really wide range of subjects. And this is a big question. I'll try to condense it a little bit.
Yeah, go on.
I'm kind of interested in how somebody begins that career, how someone starts doing that. Were you interested in those subjects and found that writing was the way into that? Were you interested in writing? Kind of how did your interest begin?
Well, my first degree was in sociology, and that was a situation which is quite common where when I was studying over here called A-levels, when I was studying for my A-levels in the UK, a particular teacher really brought the subject of sociology to life for me, and it was one of those situations when I just thought, right, what am I going to do now? And I thought, well, I'll do that. I'll do sociology. It really interests me. So I went to do sociology at university, and then as I was doing sociology, one of the modules on the course was looking at art, sort of the theory, art theory, but more to do with the sociology of art. And it was while I was doing that module in my final year that it sort of opened doors for me, and things started to click. And I mean, sort of backtracking slightly, when I was doing my A-levels, I used to finish my lessons at the local college, and then I used to walk over to the art college and just sit in the library looking at art monographs. And I used to do that like 3 or 4 times a week, every night.
Oh, wow.
Just as a sort of process of self-education, because I was interested. So when I did this module in my degree in sociology on art, I thought, okay, this is something I really want to pursue. So when I came to do my postgrad, I did a master's in visual cultural theory, which at the time was being taught by a group of professors who were closely associated or were involved in the founding of there's a journal called Radical Philosophy magazine.
Mm-hmm.
And people like Peter Osborne were teaching a lot of the modules on this MA in visual cultural theory. So it was very philosophical, very continental, lot of continental philosophy. That really, again, fascinated me. When I left, I went off in a slightly different direction when I was doing my. Tell me to stop if you want me to stop.
Oh no, keep going. This is so interesting to me.
Okay, when I was doing my last year of my masters, I did a project on. There's a working class film and photography collective in the UK in the northeast of England called Amberside, and I did an institutional project as part of my MA on this collective, and they were set up in the late 60s. And they would work with local working class communities making films and also enabling them to make films of them for themselves. So it wasn't just they were dropping in, they were establishing groups within working class communities to give them the skills to make films about their own lives. And I did that project. I went up to Newcastle, stayed with them, really influential for me. So when I left my MA, I decided to do a PhD in looking at how working class life had been transformed during the Thatcher years, and specifically looking at how film had represented those changes. It was while I was doing that that a famous feminist historian called Sheila Rosebotham approached me and said, would I like to write an essay on this subject I'm doing my PhD on for a book that's coming out. And that book that came out was called Looking at Class, came out in 2000. And I wrote an essay about this very subject of the transformation of working class life and its representation in British film. When I wrote the essay, I thought, actually, that's all I want to do. I don't want to spend another year doing this. So I decided to stop the PhD, and around the same time I was doing the PhD, I started working at the Photographers Gallery in London.
Okay.
Which is major. It was actually the first photography gallery to be set up in the UK in 1971, and I was running the archive at the gallery. And it was while I was working there that I would be helping researchers find material, and it was a real apprenticeship for me working in the Photographers Gallery. I was learning about the history of photography and all the type of details, and I was very much sort of au fait with the theories and ideas surrounding visual culture, but in terms of the nuts and bolts of the history of photography, I wasn't so much. So it was a real apprenticeship doing that. And then it was while I was doing that a colleague came to me and said, I'm really interested in this person. He keeps coming up in my research, and I said, yeah, I know this person as well. I keep seeing his name crop up, and that was Alexey Brodovitch. And he said, oh, let's make a film about him. So I said, okay, let's make a film about him. So we got in touch with all of his old students, people like Richard Avedon, Lillian Bassman, Hero, Ted Kroner, all those type of people. We went to New York, we interviewed them all, and then we basically sort of ran out of money, and that was it. It sort of stopped. And then it was through that, having all that material, which I still have all these audio recordings of the people, many of whom have now passed away. I approached a magazine called Baseline in the UK and said, would you be interested in doing an article on Alexey Brodovitch? I have loads of material. And they were like, yeah. So I wrote an article. This sounds remarkably easy, but it wasn't.
Right, yeah, I know.
It sounds like it was just like, and then they said, yeah. So I wrote an article, very short article about Brodovitch, and then Phaidon Press saw the article. They approached me and said, would you like to write a monograph about him? And I thought, okay, I'll do that. Of course, how old was I then? 29, 28.
Okay.
And I thought, wow, this is a real opportunity. I can't let this go by. So I did. And I subsequently look back at that book now quite critically, and it did get a few negative reviews from a few people, and I sort of partly agree with some of the things they say because I was sort of learning on the job, I think, with that book. But then soon, like in life, a lot of the time someone says, how did you get to this place? And it wasn't through some kind of conscious, willful choice. It was just a series of fortuitous.
Yeah.
It wasn't I was setting out to write about design history. So I did that book, and then they offered me another one, which was on Herbert Matter, which I did write. It's about a 70,000 word book. But this is a story in itself with the Herbert Matter. I travelled to the US, to Yale, and to different parts, interviewing people and gathering material. Also to Zurich to interview people and to look at the archives there, and finished the book. and then fired and got in touch with me and said, "Oh, Herbert Matter's son doesn't want to work with us anymore. Therefore, we're not publishing the book."
Wow.
We can't because he has copyright control over his father's work. That sort of dragged on for a few years. And in the time that was dragging on, they said, "Well, do you want to write another book on Josef Muller-Brockmann?" And I was like, "Okay, I'll do that." And I did use a little bit of the material from the Matter book in the Muller-Brockmann, not much, but a few sections. And I reworked them, particularly around the issues to do with Switzerland and Swiss culture. And then suddenly, when that book was published, I was sort of seen as a design historian.
Right.
I've spent the past 15 years trying to unpick and say I'm not a design historian. I'm certainly not in any shape or form, even though that's what my job title says where I teach. And but what was interesting, because of my background within film, within sort of critical theory, within philosophy, within photography, I felt I was in quite a unique position to critique design from sort of an outsider perspective. And I very much saw design as just one more sort of jumping off point for discussing ideas.
Right.
It could be film, it could be photography, it could be anything. I mean, really, with my sociological background, I mean, it could be football. It could be absolutely anything which I could, engage with, which I bring certain theoretical ideas to bear. And so that's the sort of short, narrative of how I got to the position doing those works.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And you set up a bunch of the questions that I had in that answer, so I appreciate that. I kind of want to go back to something that you said very early on about how you were kind of going to the art college and just sitting in the library and kind of studying that also.
Yeah.
Because I think that connects to something that you just said about how you saw and see design as a way to talk about ideas. And you can kind of use these design objects to talk about ideas. And that's the sense that I got from your writing, and even hearing you talk about this now, that you were interested in art and photography, film, design, all of these things, not just on an aesthetic level, not just on an object or material level, but also what they say about culture, about society, about class. Would you say that? Would you agree with that, and can you kind of talk a little more about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, one of the things I say to my students when I first meet them is that I have no interest in design, which sort of takes them back because they've just signed up for a 3-year design course.
Right.
I say I have no interest in design. What I'm interested in is what design can communicate, what it can engage with. What's the idea with a big capital I? What's the idea here? What are you attempting to do? If that idea is just to sell more crap, then I'm not particularly interested.
Right. Right.
And so, yeah, it's. I mean, obviously, there's an aesthetic enticement and an aesthetic seduction, which initially may pique an interest and want you to explore more. I accept that, and there is. There is sort of an ideology of aesthetics, conceptual examination of aesthetics, which is interested in itself as a question of the sort of philosophy of form, the philosophy of the politics of form, which I appreciate, but it's very much about and the older I've got, I've sort of realised that there are particular themes which certain objects will sort of connect to me. I'll be drawn towards them, and again, that could be film, it could be photography. I mean, in those days when I was spending time in the library, there was a sort of cultural anxiety about that as well, because I'm from a working class background. I left school pretty much with virtually no qualifications, and I was thinking, okay, there was a sort of cultural cachet or cultural capital associated with fine art, and which I felt I had an interest in it. I had an initial interest, but I felt deeply insecure about my knowledge of it. So after I'd done my politics and sociology and communication theory A-levels, I would then go and spend time in this art college library, which is no longer there. But I would spend time at this art college library in the northeast of England and just sit there flicking through books, looking at stuff, writing down names. It was just a desire and a curiosity to know more about this. It wasn't something which was I didn't have that type of exposure, that type of work at home. It just wasn't that type of place. My father and my mother and my sisters all worked within the fishing industry, and it wasn't there wasn't that type of discussion.
Right.
They gave me something else, which I subsequently realised, which wasn't necessarily that aesthetic education, but it's more of a political vision, a political outlook on the world. They certainly gave me that, and so a lot of it sort of, that's where it comes from in a way.
When you say to your students that you don't have an interest in design necessarily, and that you're kind of interested in ideas or what design can communicate, how do your students react to that? And like, how do they come along with you on that journey?
Yeah, well, some do, some don't. Some are there just because it's literally like, wow, this looks really cool, and that's about it.
Right.
Now, I teach at the University of Hertfordshire. I teach on the critical and contextual type of studies module, and that's where they have to engage with ideas. They have to write, they have to do research, they have to present in class. Okay. So I'm not teaching in the studio. I'm teaching in. I'm trying to. I try in many ways through different projects and the assignments I set to get them to think critically, visually, so they don't just sort of ghettoize the essay writing bit as, that's that part of the course, and the stuff I really want to do is in the studio.
Yeah.
So I do try and set projects. So in the recent past, I did a project with there's a museum in London called the Migration Museum, and I did a project where they had to produce a poster addressing the issue of what does migration mean in the UK today. And so it's getting them to think about ideas such as migration and the other and all these type of critical concepts, but to think about how they can visualize that. So when I say I'm not interested in design, it's really trying to get them to think, what's the driver in their work? What is it? And what I also say to them is that ultimately what interests me about them is not that they're students, it's what they bring into the room. And, they can be, we have students who are brothers and sisters and girlfriends and boyfriends and neighbours and fans and supporters and collectors and gamers, or whatever drives them, whatever is a key part of their identity. I say to them, look, you shouldn't discount that. That's possibly the most interesting and valuable thing for you, is something which maybe on the surface you think is not relevant to your education. And I say to them, look, the older you get, the more you realise that actually the most useful thing and the most sort of inspiring, fruitful thing for you can often be right on your doorstep. You don't have to go miles away. You don't have to. I think, and the thing is, often because of the way of education, students are often chasing grades, and they then get caught up in that system where they're trying to meet particular learning outcomes or things that they feel that they should be doing in a university. And I always try to say to them, look, no, that is possibly the most boring thing, ever. Yeah. And I'm more interested in what they can bring about themselves and about their relations and about their history and their experiences, and what if they can bring those into the room and bring those into their work, then it can make for a more exciting dynamic and experience.
Yeah, I love that. I'm curious how you kind of take that philosophy and apply that to writing a biography.
Yeah, I mean,
and where you come in that, how much of it is the story versus kind of your interests and your angle?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'll strictly honest with you. And this is probably where the interview will end for you. Is that I'm 28 years old, and a major publisher like Phaidon come to me and say, "Do you want to write a book about this person?" And I was like, "Yeah, Alexey Brodovitch, really fascinating guy. His life is like some kind of Hollywood movie. It's ridiculous what he went through and the type of character he was and the circles that he mixed in New York, and it was just a fascinating story, and I was really drawn to it." And the work, obviously, and I was coming to it because I was working at the Photographers Gallery. I was coming at it very much through photography, and that was the thing that was the hook for me. Now, when I moved from that to Herbert Matter, that was very much still photography, but there was obviously the design element. When I was offered the Muller-Brockmann book, I sort of looked at that and I thought, okay, right, this is a different beast altogether. But it was very much about the. I was very seduced by the narrative and about the research process and actually constructing this narrative. I wouldn't say there was a massive passion for design there when I was doing that book. And you know what? Again, I referred to me being like 27. When you're that young and someone says, "Do you want to write a book?" and you're signing on the dole in Brighton, not earning very much money, and someone says, "Do you want to do this?" You sort of snap the hand off, and I did, and I had very little income. I was doing working part-time at the Photographers Gallery, and then that was given to me, and I suddenly had to pretend that I was this accomplished, confident writer, and I wasn't, apart from my degrees. So it was, it was a type of at a moment which, like I said earlier, you make these type of steps in your life, and you suddenly realise that you go down this particular road, and and I think in some ways I'm a visual cultural theorist with a strong interest in philosophical thought, and I've been attempting since I wrote those books, I think, to try and I don't know, turn the boat around a bit and try and say, okay, actually I should have been going this way and not that way. Now, that's not to discount what I do and what I've done and what I continue to do with students. It's just I suppose it's to do with my own identity and about reshaping and rethinking who I actually am, and also when you start doing something and you become known for that thing, people then come to you asking you to do similar things, and before you know it, you're just doing that and you're known as that person, and you sort of stop one day and look around and think, how did I get here? Why? And I'm not this person, and it's I don't feel like I've answered any of your questions, but it's convoluted, it's complicated.
Well, let me ask like a slightly different question that I think is interesting, and kind of what you're saying and talking about, like, you're not disowning those books in any way, but you're saying that you feel like you have changed, or that your perception has changed, and you said you were kind of trying to turn the boat around. What does that look like to you? Or like, what is it about those that you're now kind of looking at in retrospect and that you would have done differently?
Well, you know what? I partly am disowning those books. Part of me does, and I have quite a cavalier attitude. I mean, I don't have a single copy of anything I've ever done in the house.
Interesting.
I just give them all away. I mean, once I've done something, I couldn't, even to the point when I've done something for a book and they'll send me the layouts to read for errors, I won't even read them. I'll just say, yeah, fine, and send them back. I love that. Yeah. I just have this quite cavalier attitude to things that I've done, and so I'm not totally disowning them, because it was a time and a place and a lot of effort went into them, and I enjoyed them, and I met some interesting people, and things are still coming out of them now. So, for instance, with the Brodovitch, I'm currently, or have been doing for so many years, it's dragging on, but working with the Museum for Gestaltung in Zurich, Design Museum in Zurich, doing a Brodovitch exhibition there, which should be opening in a year or so. So I'm still doing stuff off the back of it, and happily so. But I think when I'm sort of thinking about moving forward, I give those books and anything I've done, like that, I just don't hold it very highly for me. I just think, okay, that was done, and I don't really want to see it again. And And suddenly I start getting emails from people like I'm the Brodovitch expert asking me stuff about, how can I get clearance on copyright on this photograph or this poster that he did in 1928? And I'm just like, I couldn't care less, I couldn't give a damn. But
you hated getting this email to be on this podcast.
No, not at all, because you're right, because you said at the beginning, my interests are varied, and they are. For instance, I've just written a review for a photography magazine called Source, and it was a review of graphic novels of photographers. And, again, I loved it. I loved doing that and being exposed to something new and having to think on my feet and look at these objects and think, okay, what are they attempting to do? How are they succeeding? How are they, not succeeding? And so thinking critically about ideas. I think another thing as well about my work is, in the past, is that it is tied up for me with a sort of questioning and a critique of ideas of status, which it is bound up with a question of status, which I do kick back against, which is this thing of being an expert or being an authority, which for me I find politically very dubious, especially if you're in a space like a university where I strongly believe that there should be a more of a democratic relationship between the staff and the students, to the point that I feel the students should be involved in the running of a university. It shouldn't just be the staff, and it shouldn't just be management. So these ideas that I should take some kind of just accrue some kind of status from the work I've done, I actually actively resist that and try and kick back against it as much as I can. As to the point that I just couldn't give a damn about anything I've done, ultimately. And it's about what's going to happen next. Right. It's about what can we do? What can we engage with together? How can we create something new? How can we respond to this problem? And it's key. What I'm saying there is we, not me. Is how we can respond to these issues. What's going on in the world? How can we engage with that visually? Maybe through design, maybe through film, and I'm always trying to find a way of creating a life like that, which is hard when you're working within it's hard when you're working within institutions who do you often find that there is this hierarchy and there is type of very formalized way of doing things, and
you're talking about this kind of your interest in philosophy and your interest in how these things can kind of lead us to larger ideas. And I'm interested in if there's a difference, or if you've seen a difference in your research and writing when you're writing about design versus something like photography and film, that I will be honest, I feel like has a much richer philosophical discourse around it than design does. But I don't know if that's because I am a designer and so I'm in it and I'm looking at these other things as an outsider. How do you feel about that? Or do you see a difference?
Yeah, there is a difference. I mean, partly because the history of photography, the history of film, art history, they are older and more established fields than design history. And Rick Poynter is sort of banged on about this over the past 20 years or more, and it's changed dramatically now. I mean, it has changed dramatically, but for a long time, design history and writing critically about design almost always had to sort of justify itself in relation to studio practice. Right. There seemed to be design theory as the handmaiden of studio practice. It's about what it could deliver in terms of practical outcomes. Now, you don't get that in art history and art theory and film theory and film history. You don't have film theorists being questioned about, well, how does this relate to the studio? How does this relate to film directors' work? You don't, and there is a confidence about it now. I think this is an old debate now, and I think design theory and history has achieved that, or is still achieving it. So it's to answer your question, it's probably partly to do with that historical precedent in those different fields, and there's probably more text to not probably there are more text to draw on, more books, conferences, journals, magazines. There's just a greater body of material when you come to write a work about photography or film than there is about design. But I think in that way it can be a positive thing, because, and it's something I always say to students, is that it means that you have to go off into these different fields, whether it's economics, whether it's history, whether it's sociology. You have to go off into these other fields and do that type of research, and then bring that back to design. And it can make for a more exciting piece of work. So maybe one of the benefits of not being so established is that design theory history is more porous, it's more open to influence, and it's not fully canonized in the way that maybe the history of photography and fine art and film are, which again, I think, going back to my earlier point about maybe more democratic models of education and more democratic models, radical sort of pedagogic models within university, maybe design is really well placed for that, and it can you can really engage with a variety of ideas in a sort of radical way.
Yeah. I mean, I even think about a lot about how even these kind of definitions between different fields are getting blurrier and blurrier, and the kind of clear sense of what design is it isn't as clear as it used to be, and that you kind of have to be moving across different disciplines and different mediums now, Yeah,
no, I totally agree. I mean, when I did my book on Brodovitch, I saw that in the 1920s, you had designers creating theatre sets, they were doing menu designs, they were doing jewellery, they were doing sculpture, they were doing posters, they were doing books. And obviously the language of being known as a designer didn't exist at that point. But they were working across all these different platforms. Now, you've seen throughout the 20th century that there was an increasing sort of codification of what it meant to be a designer. But what's happened in the sort of digital age is those narrow definitions of what it means to be a designer have almost gone back to the earlier 1920s idea of working across different areas. And, the merging of platforms in the digital type of sphere is enabling that and encouraging that. So we might be thinking, I think there's a PhD in this, but you might be thinking that, bookmarking the sort of 1920s, 1930s, and then the sort of 1990s as the period of the designer. And in a way, what's happening now is that this type of idea of this individual designer who works within these very narrow areas maybe is starting to fracture again. But I would argue that it was fractured towards the beginning, specifically in the 20th century anyway, just in the nature of the work that commercial artists, as would be doing at that time, was so diverse.
Yeah. That's so interesting. I've never thought about it exactly like that. I've been kind of dancing around that idea for years now, and you just said it in like 2 minutes, exactly the way I've been trying to think about it. I love that. I'm curious, you mentioned earlier about that you're kind of always interested in the new thing. What's the next thing that we can build together? What's on your mind now? What are the things that you're thinking about next, or where's your research kind of headed?
Well, I'm doing a PhD. I'm coming to the end of a PhD at the moment on the work of the French philosopher Alain Badiou, and it's sort of the whole thesis idea emerged very much out of that discussion that I mentioned earlier about what does it mean to teach history, what does it mean to practice history, what does it mean to be a historian. It emerged out of those frustrations and sort of the need to think about how does the subject of a historian relate to its field, which can circumvent, undercut notions of authority and status. And I was led to Badiou's work partly because he sees, or he connects radical historical transformation with radical subjective transformation. So it's through the subject, and by subject I don't necessarily mean individual. It could be the subject, it could be a crowd, it could be the masses, it could be anything in that sense. And it's for me it was like, okay, how do these two areas come together where a radical historical change manifests itself through new forms of subjectivity, and then possibly how does that translate into the increasingly commodified world of higher education in the UK. So my research of this project now is coming towards, well, I say that PhDs never come to a conclusion. They sort of you just have to stop at some point.
Right.
And so that's really where my mind is a lot of the time when I'm not teaching and when I'm not doing reviews or things like that. It's thinking about that, and it's actually had a quite profound influence on me doing this PhD over the past 4 years, about how I think about the subject of design history of any historical form. It's about how does that relate to the person doing that type of research, that type of work. How does that feed into how you speak to people about it, how you position yourself, and what do you write about, what becomes important. And Bourdieu's work is notoriously complex because he bases a lot of his philosophical thought on mathematics and notions of infinity and all the rest of it. So yeah, that's been occupying my mind, and I have stepped away from writing about design because of that, and it's taking me somewhere else, and it's sort of enthusing me. Again, one of the reasons I turned to the PhD and the subject was a frustration with doing projects for the sake of doing projects. So someone would come to me and say, "Oh, would you like to do a book on this photographer?" And I was like, and then somebody say, "We'll pay you £3,000 advance for it," and I'll be like, "Oh, okay, yeah, I'll do it." It's a freelancer's mentality. Yeah, I'll do it. And then, but what I realised after doing one book, which sort of fell apart a bit, partly because I got into an argument with the photographer, and it sort of fell apart. And my wife said to me, she said, "What are you doing? You're doing these projects that you don't really have a great passion for. You're doing them just because it's another book, and you feel like you should. Oh, I've got to have another book. Got to have another book. What book have I got going at the moment?" And she said, "What do you really want to do?" And I was like, "Well, this question really bothers me. What I've just spoken about in terms of history." Yeah. And she said, "Well, why don't you do that? Do a PhD in that?" And so I've had to withdraw from the type of writing about design and go into my little silo to think about these questions and these issues. I mean, out of it will come another book, but it'll be something very different and very a million miles away from what I've done in the past. But if I look back and think about there's earlier projects that I did at looking at working class life and film, and work with type of cooperatives in the northeast, and there is something of that still there in the project, and about questioning of relationships and things like that.
Yeah, I was going to say it obviously is a different subject and a different kind of mode of working, but it still seems very connected to a lot of the questions that it sounds like you've been asking for your entire career. Well, I think it's the same, isn't it? It's like a singer-songwriter, and when they get to the end of their career, they look back and all their songs are about the same thing. It's type of, right. It's always the same subject coming back up, and just spun in different versions. And so no, it is, and it's one of the words that Bourdieu uses in his work is he talks about fidelity and a fidelity to something which maybe was the initial spark, which was the thing that really made you want to do something. And when I think back to doing the A-level sociology and that particular lecturer,
there was a spark there of something, of questioning institutions, of questioning relationships, and so in a way, I think doing this PhD has made me realise that I'm just trying to stay true to this original event.
Right. I love that. I like kind of how that has come now full circle in this conversation. My last question, this is a question that I used to end all of these interviews. And you've mentioned a couple people throughout, but I'm curious if there are any books or authors or critics, historians, philosophers who have really influenced kind of how you think about all of this that we've talked about today.
Oh, gosh. I don't know. I mean, the reading. I mean, you've got to go back so far. I mean, I don't know really. I mean, there's so many different writers. Gosh, that's a really hard question.
We could ask it a different way and just kind of who are you reading right now also,
Right,
or
well,
are there any people that you're excited about now?
Yeah, well, I tend to, at the moment, I've recently found myself being drawn towards not necessarily authors, but particular publishers. And so I'll find a book from a publisher. So there's two publishers in the UK, one Zero Books and Repeater Books. And they're doing really interesting publications on popular culture, but via a sort of philosophical filter, and looking at different issues, whether it's meme culture or whether it's working remotely digitally, so a sort of a digital worker, and those two publishers I tend to just buy stuff that they publish and just read because it's engaging with something in a really interesting way, and also it has that eclectic quality which I feel I'm drawn to. So the one I'm reading at the moment is I'll just grab this off my desk. 1 second. See that's buggered up the continuity for your podcast there. So leave it in. There's a book by a guy called Joe Kennedy. It's called Games Without Frontiers. So it's looking at football, and it's saying, looking at is football inherently political? What does football actually mean today? Looking at football through contemporary society. So it's basically, and he looks at football as an example of sort of modernism in the 20th century and what's happening with the sort of hyper-commercialised, commodified world that is football today, especially in the UK. And so it's that desire to, just follow particular threads. It's sort of a wandering mind in a way. You sort of follow a particular thread, a particular idea, and it leads you somewhere interesting, and then you don't know where it's going to take you, where it's going to end up. But and it's about, as I say to the students, it's just about curiosity. You just got to bend down and pick it up.
I love that. I feel like that's such a great way to end this conversation. Kerry, I'm a big fan. I loved this conversation. I love the way you kind of think about your work. Thank you so much for being on the podcast.
No, it's okay. No worries. Thanks for having me.
This episode was recorded on March 13th, 2019. Our theme music is by Andy Borgasani. We're on Twitter and Instagram at Surface Podcast. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts and at scratchingthesurface.fm. Thanks for listening.